Hey, Benny, welcome to Millionaire University. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. You have a very intriguing background. It's going to be a fun conversation. I know you have a lot to bring to the table for our listeners who are in the process of building, scaling businesses. So let's start with your story and
Sure,
just diving into where you're at right now and kind of how you got to this point.
sure. I got this sort of entrepreneurial bug when I was pretty young. When I went to music school, when I finished music school, I made my way into a internship at a company that did music for TV commercials. And I learned a bunch of normal stuff that you learn when you're like 21, 22 in this sort of new environment. But the thing that intrigued me the most was seeing the process by which brand money, big brand money, would sort of flow through an ad agency. And then from the agency, it would flow to these dudes who ran the studio who made music.
Mm-hmm.
And those guys were really great guys. They were super talented. And there's all these reasons why they were attractive to those who were spending the money to make music for TV commercials and whatnot. But they were just dudes. They were like, I don't know how old they were, probably in their 30s, early 30s, maybe late 20s. And after that time finished and I went on to do other things, I was sort of like, okay, that's interesting. There's just a world in which you have a certain size bucket and a certain kind of thing, and you catch money that comes down. And I didn't like having them as a boss. And I really didn't like the idea of having a boss at all. So I sort of always thought, okay, entrepreneurship, that's interesting. When I finished my schooling and I did a bunch of this stuff, I eventually started a company that did content for social media, which is as common now as you can imagine. But back when I did it in 2009, 2010, it was relatively novel. And then I eventually sold that business, then went on to try to build software. A lot of learnings there, meaning about mainly there's this feeling of founder product misfit
Mm-hmm.
that in retrospect I really understand. There was a mismatch. It wasn't a good fit for me because the business we were trying to build, we were very early in influencer marketing, and we tried to build a tool that helped manage groups of influencers for brands. And I know it was a poor founder market fit. Maybe other people have talked about product market fit, which is just a general term for having a product that fits a market. People don't really talk about founder product fit or founder company fit, but I definitely was there was not a good fit. And I know it wasn't a good fit because there were companies doing very similar things that went on to become valued at hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, and absolutely crush it and build huge businesses. Meanwhile, after a year and change, we were like, I don't think it's going to work. And we shut it down. So that was my second company. But through that process, I met a lot of entrepreneurs and I got really good at certain growth building tools, including cold email and managing cold email and that stuff. So then I ended up starting a business in 2016 that just focused on cold email. And that, again, was pretty novel at the time. Now, cold email is one of the tools that everyone does. At the time, it was much more rare. There was maybe a handful of companies that were serving that market.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a little bit of a secret weapon. I used to have call after call after call, people that were like, "Oh, those annoying emails. Like, why would I ever send cold emails?" And I'm like trying to convince them that cold email is a good idea for them. And now that's just not the case anymore. Everyone's like, "Oh, cold email, got to do it myself, hire an agency. How am I going to sort it out?" And then in 2020, we shifted the focus of the business to be on email deliverability because email deliverability started to really matter a lot in 2020. And since then, that's the direction we've built the business. And the whole industry sort of caught up, and now email deliverability themed businesses are a dime a dozen. And so I'm not quite
Yeah.
sure what the next innovation is going to be, but
Mm.
I've been fortunate enough to be a little bit ahead, but not too ahead. Because if you're too ahead, then you don't really survive. But at the same
Yeah.
time, I'm also built what I consider very conventional businesses. We don't innovate on business models, really. We don't innovate on. There's a lot of intelligence and not a lot of cleverness. If that
Mm-hmm.
makes sense.
Yeah.
We're a service business. We have clients that pay us either one time, but usually recurring, and we're solving an ongoing problem for them. And we care a lot about their success. And usually, if we succeed, they stay. And sometimes, even if we succeed, they leave, and you can't control those things. And that's just sort of the nature of the beast. There's 10 of us now, but at one point we were as many as 24. So we've seen a cycle where we had a lot of clients and we need a lot of people to support it. And then we sort of shifted to a lighter weight model, focusing on email deliverability, and that sort of required less headcount. And so we have to shift around. So we've sort of been through a bit. I'm the owner and founder and CEO, and I'm the sole owner. So it makes it a little bit easier to maneuver.
Yeah. I want to just go back to a few things that you said, and thank you for the introduction
Sure.
and just giving us that insight. When you talk about, I think this is such an important thing to know what that founder market fit looked like. And like you said, there were other companies that thrived and did really well. I think sometimes we can, when we don't have that awareness, when we don't see the mismatch soon enough, it can have a really long-term effect in a negative way. And I love that you have the perspective just to see that and even recognize that. And it wasn't necessarily like that you are a terrible entrepreneur or that the concept wasn't good, right? We can throw the baby out with the bathwater. I kind of hate that phrase, but for lack of a better phrase, what should we be insightful about as we're looking, maybe we're building, we're running up against the wall. Like what led you to say, okay, this isn't working. And now in retrospect, I can see these are some of the telltale signs that other people can be looking for.
Sure. Well, I think if I'm not a sports guy, and if you look at me, you probably not think I'm a sports guy, so that's good. I'm skinny and weak. It's like a combination. But if you think about, there are sports that require just insane amounts of grit and focus, but not very much equipment. And then there are sports that require a tremendous amount of equipment and just a lot of stuff. Like, I don't know, you're out in Utah, you said. So there are a lot
Mm-hmm.
of people that are into horses in Utah, and there are really cool horse related sports. But I'm in Brooklyn. So that's going to be tricky for me to get really into like a horse related sport, for
Yeah.
example. So that's like one weird kind of example. The reason why I say that is that you as an entrepreneur, there are sort of tool sets that you have at your disposal. And sometimes those tools are really obvious to you and they're right in front of you, and you can easily leverage those to make a differentiated business. And sometimes those tools are distant and unknown and confusing. So I'll give you another example because I mean, one thing that's nice about business is that it can kind of be whatever you want it to be as long as it's legal and sort of serve someone in a positive way.
Yeah.
If you think about someone, well, I'll give you an example. I was reading an article recently around the LA fires, and some of the people that became private fire support staff, people who were like, hey, I need someone to come help because the fire department isn't covering my house and I need that help and I have money to pay, which the morality of that aside, were people who were doing water things for movies. So
Mm.
they already have water trucks. They always already have crew that know how to handle hoses. They already have like all these things that they need. So the idea of
Yeah.
being like, oh, we could shift from doing just business, doing this way to that way. And another idea would be if you, well, anyway, what we're trying to look for in business and opportunity is things that aren't a crazy far cry from where you are. And if
Mm.
you really are interested in something that's really far outside of your quote wheelhouse, you need to take more steps to get closer to the thing before you can launch the business.
Mm. So what would you have done differently then and you can continue on with more examples, but in your specific situation, you'd had this background of social media. So
Sure.
where was the disconnect there, and what could you have done looking back now to meet that a little bit closer to where it was more in your wheelhouse?
I mean, that's a tricky question because a lot of the businesses that people try to build that aren't in their wheelhouse just shouldn't be just shouldn't be done by you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to use like a funny phrase, if you're thinking about fintech, well, there's a lot of finance guys. There's just a lot of finance. I would say guys. It can be any gender. There's a lot of finance people. So if
Mm-hmm.
you're kind of driving around in your car and thinking about, that buy now, pay later, that's a pretty interesting business model. I should start one of those. Well, okay. Are you a finance guy? No. Okay. Well, do you know anything about lending money to people and all the regulations and rules and all these things? Well, no. Okay. So possibly the reason why it sounds so attractive is because you don't know all the details associated with it.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Like
you
the
just
way I'm describing
summarized
it?
shiny object syndrome, right? Like that's why we get drawn because it's the unknown. It's exciting. We're not aware of all the limitations yet. And so this feels like a better opportunity because it works for these people. So that must be a better option than this other thing that I now know all the limitations of.
Exactly. That is a much more succinct way to say it. Now, that said, sometimes you fall in love with something, an idea or a concept, and you're willing to do all of the intermediate steps to build towards succeeding at it.
Hmm.
So that becomes a different kind of project where you say, okay, I listen to this Benny guy. I'm not a finance guy. True. But there's a lot of certifications you can get online if you're willing to do the work. There are a lot of job opportunities that I don't know if you want to change jobs or whatnot, but a lot of things you can do. You could also do really basic things to become a finance guy. So the question is, are you willing to do all the intermediate steps to be able to become the person that then could do this?
Hmm.
And at the time in my life, I wasn't.
Mm.
So influencer marketing was a thing. I wasn't working in an agency that was already dealing with big brands and was interested in running influencer marketing and saying, hey, this could be done more efficiently. I should start a platform that does it better. I didn't come from a legacy background of what you'd call like sponsorship management or something, where
Yeah.
an example of that would be you work at a sports brand and there's 15 artists that are signed for your thing and you're managing them, even though it's not a one and done influencer thing. It's like an ongoing endorsement kind of scenario. Wasn't working that. And I wasn't so in love with the idea and the concept that I was like, you know what? I'm going to take a year or a month or even 3 months and like get into this and learn it. Like,
Mm.
okay, then it's sort of like I play a lot of instruments because I went to music school and I love music and that's really like something I think a lot about. People tell me almost every day, "Oh, I'd love to play violin." Okay, cool. Well, I've been playing violin since I was 6, 7 years old. I don't have to think about being able to play violin because it's sort of baked into my brain.
Yeah.
How many of those people are actually gonna get a violin, annoy the out of their partner or, uh, roommates, rent a practice room, carry the violin over the practice room? Well, those are the people that are gonna be able to play the violin, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with not playing the violin.
Yeah.
If you already have a guitar, you can play the guitar.
Mm.
Like that's okay. So I always,
Yeah.
whenever people tell me about businesses that don't seem to be a founder market fit, that's usually where my mind goes. Okay,
Mm.
well, it doesn't sound like it's a good fit. What are all the intermediate steps to get you to being able to actually do that? And do you want to do that?
Yeah.
But the good news
So
is you
there,
can do all the intermediate steps. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that.
yeah. There just has to be some alignment and some like drive and passion for what you're doing. And I think, my husband has come up against this a few times where he has things that are actually in his wheelhouse, but he doesn't engage and he doesn't build something from it because he knows I don't love this enough and I'm not invested enough. I don't care enough about this. Like this isn't my problem to solve. This isn't my hill to die on. And so because of that, he's aware, which I think is really powerful to have that awareness. Um, and it's and making sure that it's not just saying like, oh, that's going to be really hard. I don't know if I dare. Just having the emotional maturity to say I can, but I'm not going to. And I have a phrase that's kind of been part of my life, a mantra lately. It's an option. It's not necessarily an opportunity. And knowing the difference between both, right? Like it's an opportunity when it aligns with your passion, your vision for your own life, and the things that you really want to engage in. And it's a great timing, and it's all the things are there. And it's an option when it's like, yeah, this is one thing that somebody could do to make money. It's not an opportunity if it's not something I really want to do.
Mm,
And I think I'm glad that we've kind of went down this path because I think it's so critical for entrepreneurs to know the difference
sure.
because otherwise you're going to get pulled down 80 different rivers in your
Now
first year.
that said, let's do everyone a service and just do the counterfactual.
Yeah.
The counterfactual is that oftentimes outsiders to something build better businesses in that market.
Mm,
And your outside view is a really valuable view.
yeah.
So there's really nothing wrong with saying, okay, well, I'm not a finance guy, fine. Or I'm not a whatever guy, fine. However, I'm going to spend time at my whiteboard or with my notepad. I'm going to try to sketch out why and how this could be done much better, more efficiently, more interesting. And once you've done a certain amount of thinking on a subject, then it's not that hard to actually reach out to an expert in it and say to that person, you can do it on cold on LinkedIn or whatever, and just say, hey, I've been thinking a lot about this subject and I have a bunch of notes on it. And I'm not really a person to do it, but I'm really interested in talking to an expert to either tell me why it's a good idea or a bad idea. Most people will take that call
Mm-hmm.
because it's such an honest, earnest place, and it's not a weird message and spray and pray kind of thing. You're like reaching out to people that want
Yeah.
to. Worst case scenario, you could find a professor in the subject. Well, no matter what the subject is, there's some person that's an adjunct professor or something related to it, and pay them an hourly rate to pick their brain on the same
Mm.
subject. But the reason why I'm saying that is that there is nothing wrong with being an outsider and working
Mm-hmm.
your way into something. And there's nothing wrong with developing a passion for something that's interesting to you, even if you don't start out with like a burning
Yeah.
passion for it. Like,
Yeah.
that happens a lot. You sort of, like a really dumb thing would be like, you drive by this really cool farm stand every day and you're like, man, I drive by this farm stand every day and there's never any customers there. And you're like, I could probably operate this farm stand better than whoever's operating it. Well, are you a farmer? No. Do you own the land? No. Is the farm stand owned by the farm next to it? Yes. Have you ever done retail before? No. But there could be a lot of things that just get you thinking like, yeah, there's a few like really obvious things that if they just changed, there would probably be customers here. You
Mm.
know what I mean? So
Yeah.
it's like, well, it's such a simple entrepreneurship motion in the sense to
Yeah.
then pursue it. And even if at the end of the day, after you went and you found out who owned the farm stand and you talked to them and you talked to the farmer who owns the land, who leases it to the farmers and people, and you did all this work, at that point, you very well may say, yeah, not my problem.
Mm.
Actually, I kind of get it now, like why it's kind of a lost cause. I'll let it go. But at
Yeah.
least you did the work. You sort of
Yep.
check that box off. You can turn the page physically in your notebook and be like, okay, that was
Mm-hmm.
cool.
Yeah.
You know,
No, I'm glad you brought that up because there's definitely two different ways to look at that. And I think that I think it's all about intention, right? And if you're recognizing in yourself a pattern to leap from thing to thing, maybe see something through, maybe follow through on that thought and just see what do you actually need to know. And don't I think a lot of people do say, oh, I can never do that. I don't even have XYZ background. Like I'm not a finance guy. I'm not a farmer.
yeah,
My husband works in higher education right now. No
mm,
ambition whatsoever to go into higher ed, but he's bringing his arts and marketing background there. And he's actually like been able to do things that just another educator and adjunct professor couldn't do. And so I think that there's definitely opportunities there, and you have to find where you're at in that pattern and make sure you don't rule things out, but that you're also not staying in a place where it's not in alignment, like you recognized, I think, with that company. So really interesting conversation. Not the direction I planned to go, but I think it's really important.
I think there's a bunch of different patterns I see. So first of all, a lot of folks don't really have the option to do grand gestures of entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
But the micro gestures of entrepreneurship are the ones that typically change your life for the positive.
Hmm.
In other words, if you have a pretty steady job, you make 60K a year, you're doing your thing, pays the bills, you can't live lavish, but things are okay. It's the $1,000 extra per month you're able to generate from the business that really is the life-changing money, not the sort of steady rock
Yeah.
money, usually. So I think that a lot of times folks, they want to think really big and think that there's some sort of multi-billion dollar goal out there. But really, the small gestures or the small acts of entrepreneurship are the ones that really sort of move you along and move you towards whatever next thing you're thinking about or whatever. And so
Yeah.
oftentimes the sort of micro element of it is an okay thing to think about. Now, that's not very exciting, and it's oftentimes doesn't really get you excited. So sometimes it's really fun to think like very, very, very large, and then you can sort of shrink it down. And sometimes while pursuing something really, really large, you find something
Hmm.
really interesting and sort of small. But that sort of pursuit of the very, very large thing is what leads you to it,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Yep. Totally does.
So like an example would be, I'm going to riff on your husband, even though I've never talked to the person. They might have gotten to higher ed for whatever purpose, and they're like, you know what, these undergraduates, these graduate students, this is really interesting. This is like I mean, that's how I always feel when I talk to college students. I'm always like, wow, these are creatures who have not been jaded
Mm.
by the world in the same way. They have all of the
Yep.
brain capacity, but they have not been beaten down in quite the same way. Really interesting ideas come out of these wonderful creatures, you know? So then the children can become the inspiring thing, even though it's possible that your husband's like, I want to start a for-profit university that is like a multi-billion-dollar institution. And I was like, my first step is I'm going to get a job at university. And then at the university, like, oh, I get this now. There's something else going on here, and there's more interesting things I can do right here. And I don't need to own a university. I can, you know.
Yeah.
So I
Yep.
think, but that sort of path, you owe it to yourself as a person who's interested in adding that dimension to your life to earnestly pursue things. And I
Mm-hmm.
learned something really early on, that I had an entrepreneurial spirit. And a lot of people listening probably have an entrepreneurial spirit, whether they're doing something directly entrepreneurial or they're doing the specific entrepreneurial thing they want to be doing, which is a sort of different topic. I had an entrepreneurial spirit, and I realized that if I shared the idea too soon with the wrong person, they would shoot it down. And I didn't. And almost all ideas are delicate, no matter how strong you are.
Mm-hmm.
You're nodding vigorously, so I assume you know what
I
I mean.
do. Yep.
It's sort of, you have to, and the other side is also harmful, I find, if you
Mm-hmm.
share with someone who's overly encouraging. You see
Yep.
this all the time, because you seem like you're an entrepreneurial spirit as well. People will say to you, I really want to blah, and they'll tell it to you. And then as a fellow entrepreneurial person, you'll be like, that's a great idea. Well, guess what? I'm going to ask that person about that for 10 years. Every single time it's like, what about that idea you had? Are you doing anything with that? You were so excited about that in May of 2011 when we talked. And they'll be like, what? No, I don't have any interest in that at all. But they'll be like, oh yeah, for a while I was, because I was that kind of person who just share it. And you sort of confuse people, and you lose the firepower you need when you're like really are committed to something and you really need
Yeah.
support with it. So I think it does make a lot of sense, if you're in that mode, to have the notebook, and you write the notebook and use ChatGPT and use the internet, and you really think, and you can do really normal things, like set a timer for the next hour. I'm going to dig into this. When the hour's up, I'm going to move on to something else, because I can't get lost in dream world. This is just a dream, you know?
Yeah.
And you can play with all these things. You can be like, what if I owned an airline? Okay, cool. You know that route that I always take between, blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah? It's only like 2 planes a week. It's weird. What if I leased an airplane and did it? What would that take? Well, that's a dumb
Mm.
idea. If you say that to your wife or best friend or whatever, they're going to tell you you're an idiot. You don't have a pilot's license. You don't know how to fly. You barely can keep your car in good shape. How are you supposed to maintain an airplane? There's a million things. However, after an hour with a notebook, you know what conclusion you're going to come to? Well, that's a business. I'm definitely not going to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But you learned something.
Yeah.
So it's sort
Yep.
of like it can make sense to just nurture a little flame. You just have the little flame, and it's crackling away, and you spend the time until the candle's burnt out. Or if you really discover something really interesting, well, then now you've built enough confidence and momentum with it that it's not so easy to extinguish. So when you say it
Mm-hmm.
to someone, they can't dismiss it. Or if they dismiss it, you can be like, it's cool, don't worry about it. I'll either do it or I won't do it, but it doesn't really have to do with your specific opinion about it.
Yep. That's really important advice too, that I think everybody needs to hear at any point, because there are so many different business ideas that I've had, and I think I've fit into both molds sometimes, where I've held things closer to the cuff, and there's times, most of the time, it's like, this is what I'm going to do now, and you lose the firepower that you need. I think that's okay to pivot. I think it's okay to, flush ideas out and everything, but I do think that I've even learned there's a dopamine hit you get by talking about the thing you want to do, that will almost release the dream a little bit, and you're not as motivated to do it, because I've even done this with travel where I will plan a trip and I will go through the whole thing in my head and I basically go on the trip and then I suddenly don't really care if I go or not because I went through the dopamine hit in the planning phase, right?
Yeah. I think there was one trick that I learned that kind of can work, which is if you do want to play with an idea with someone who's just a straight up naysayer,
Mhm.
which happen. I mean, it's okay. We all have people in our lives that are they're just naysayers. That's okay. They just go, "That's a stupid idea." They dismiss it. But if you do want to go down that path and you're eager enough and you want to talk about it, or you don't have anyone to talk with about it, so you're going to talk with whoever you can about it, just don't make it an idea for yourself. Just don't do that. Like if you really thought like, it's so weird. Everyone I know flies from San Diego to St. George. That's just such a common route. But it's so weird. We all have to fly through Orange County or LA. It's like so inconvenient.
Mhm.
Why hasn't someone started that? And the person's like, yeah, why hasn't someone started that? You're like, what does it take to like lease a plane? Like, I don't know, let's Google it together. Like you're now having a conversation that's sort of like, what if we, how much did it cost to get a private jet to take us next time? We're all going the same route. Ooh, $26,000 one way. Ooh, that's how many seats are in the plane? 10. I don't think we can get that kind of money together. Okay, interesting. But you're doing this process of like mapping out a sort of business
Mhm.
with a person that's a naysayer as a sort of adventure,
Mm.
not being like, I'm going to be an entrepreneur. I'm going to be the next, CEO of Southwest. I don't even know what their name is, but you know what I mean? Because that
Yeah.
can be weird. Just like the farm stand example. Just next time you drive by and you're with the car, like, why do you think no one's ever at that farm stand?
Mm.
What do you think the deal is with that place?
Yeah.
And then they'll be
Yep.
like, actually on Sunday it's really busy, and be like, I had no idea because I always see it on my commute. I don't even see it. Okay, well maybe I'll stop by on a Sunday and see. So anyway, I think you sort of frame it as a little bit more of a hypothetical and less of like this is
Less ownership to where it's like a reflection of them telling you no or telling your idea is dumb. You can just see the idea for what it is as an idea or a concept and a question, a
yeah.
curiosity. And yeah, that's an interesting approach. I'm going to have to try that because people are excited to engage in conversation when there's not that pressure of like, oh, you're throwing out an idea. And that's kind of like, a threat to my ego a little bit too. And you just let it be what it is.
Yeah. I had a friend years ago who was a martial arts expert and he wanted to open a gym. And what you learn through doing entrepreneurship and reading about and listening to this kind of podcast and sort of going down that path is you get a sense of what makes a brick and mortar business really hard, for example.
Hmm.
And even though you're not an expert on it, you sort of have this sort of inherent sense of like, that seems like I'm saying, we'll start an airline. It's like, that seems expensive. I don't even know why. But airplanes seem to be expensive. Jet fuel seems to be expensive. You gotta get people on the seats. It's like that seems kind of like a business that probably is expensive. And so when he said he was gonna start his martial arts studio, my first thought was like, well, commercial leases are really expensive.
Hmm.
But you have to be really careful when you're talking to people about their ideas because you don't really want to be the person that goes, commercial leases are super expensive. Those businesses barely have profit margin. You'd have to have hundreds of concurrent members in order to make it worthwhile. Business, goodbye. And you start to realize, like, well, wait a minute. They're a black belt. They're really skilled. They already do teaching. There's already these assets that they have. But the reason why I was telling this story is I tend to like to think about alternative routes to the same sort of outcome,
Hmm.
if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, an example of that would be, well, the guy who runs the charter jet service that does leave from St. George? Why don't you have a chat with him and ask him if he would open up a line to San Diego? And then maybe you just have like a really light marketing partnership where you say, hey, every seat that I can sell on the plane, you give me a cut. Okay,
Mm.
well, you're not an airline operator, you're not bearing any of the risk. But now you and the 50 friends from whatever that all go to San Diego, well, now you have a wherewithal to kind of do something with it. So that's a baby step, and it doesn't
Hmm.
bring up the conversation of like, well, you don't know anything about operating an airline. Fact.
Yeah.
That is
Yeah.
a fact. However, you did have a conversation with the person. They know how to operate an airline, and you build from there. So
Hmm.
I think that there's always that sort of other route. And in the case of my friend, I said, there's a lot of martial arts gyms around. Maybe there's off hours you could rent to get your foot in the door and get started and have a physical location and have all the things you need, but not have to bear the lease full time. And that's actually what they did. And it was a very successful
Hmm.
thing because my buddy didn't want to teach kids. So that meant, and the other gym was mainly focused on kids, which meant that there was a difference in the hours enough that there was enough free time that they could do both at the same time. And the gym leaseholder loved the extra income because it reduced their risk. And my buddy benefited from having the space without having to have a 10-year lease and all of the things associated with it.
So smart.
Is that not an entrepreneurship love story?
Yeah.
It's like your friend that always said, I really want to start the bakery. And you say, well, there's a lot of restaurants around that only open at like 2 p.m. Maybe you can
Hmm.
rent their kitchen in the morning and then you have a cleaning crew come in between this and this and you know what I mean? I mean, this
Yeah.
isn't like a revolution, but oftentimes the sort of ridiculously hard, heavy, expensive part of any idea is exactly the part that you don't have to bear
Yeah.
because someone else took that burden
Yeah.
and they would love for you to be the person that relieves that burden slightly.
Yep. Wow, that's so important. I love that. I think that there's so many of us who have the big dream and we're so focused on the whole scope of that we don't even see those micro steps that are optional. I think in life we do this, right? We look at the macro and it's really hard to see the micros are even an option and even being able to be curious to discover those kinds of different ways. And I think on a podcast like this where we're talking so much about building businesses, companies of all shapes and sizes, that it's not a lesser than approach to start with something micro like that and allow it to expand over time. And it's
Yes.
kind of like this, it's even the option, of apprenticing and being able to find ways you can get paid to learn as you grow in that understanding and then go to the next level.
Kristen, the problem, sometimes people ask me, I'm not like a super popular person to ask for advice or anything. It's not like a line out the door or I'm like some sort of business coach. I actually only try to give advice to people that ask me. And I find that the worst conversations in my life are when I'm giving unsolicited advice,
Hmm.
which I walk myself into too often. But I have this sort of feeling that I come back to again and again, which I just call realness. I'm doing air quotes like realness. There are things that are very real. I'm not making some sort of weird metaphysical thing like nothing in the world is real. But there are
Hmm.
certain things that they feel real. And there's certain things that don't feel real. So to a banker, a bank is a very real thing. To me, when I think about a bank and the concept of a bank, I'm like, is that really a thing? You put money in it and then they lend it out 6 times or 8 times? Like, what is going on? Like, that doesn't seem very real to me. Well, it's a good thing I'm not a banker, and it's a good thing that I'm not trying to start a bank. So
Hmm.
I think that some things feel real and some things just don't real. They feel not real. There are other examples that are more sort of simple and basic. If you listen to music that you don't like, you feel this is fake. This is not a good use of my ear space. Get this out of my ears. I'd rather have silence than this. But when you're listening
Hmm.
to music you like, you're like, this is real. I feel connected to this. I feel good about this moment. I think that people are looking for businesses and business ideas that feel real to them.
Hmm.
And they go, no, 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 no. I need to have the perfect bakery. It needs to have the tables exactly as I want them. It needs to have the front door exactly as I like it. And it needs to be painted the color that I like it. And it needs to have a name on the top in the font that I like and all these things. And that's okay. That's what feels really real to them. And maybe that makes their dream much further away. And maybe they will achieve it or won't achieve it. But on a basic level, we're trying to convince someone that a smaller version of it is real. And that
Hmm.
same person might be like, no, I want to own an airline. You don't understand. I want to own an airline. I don't want to be someone selling seats on someone else's plane. And you're like,
Hmm.
okay, okay. But that's okay. So I think that we're sort of very measured and trying to encourage people to do a very reasonable, profitable, simple approach to something. And
Yeah.
they actually, that might not feel real enough for them. And
Mm-hmm.
we could make an argument, we could put on our psychoanalyst hat and say, okay, I get it. You're setting an achievement so large that you can't achieve it because then you can't have failed doing it or whatever all the reasons.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what therapists tell people these days, but that kind of feeling,
Mm-hmm.
maybe that's true. But I know for a fact that I see it all around me. People are starting really small things in a really interesting roundabout way and getting very clever with how they do it
Mm-hmm.
and baby stepping into bigger, more interesting things. That is a fact. So you could
Yep.
sort of, you don't have to have the big dream that you can't compromise on, but you can use the small thing to build to the big thing.
And I think it's not a trade-off, right? It's not trying to downsize your dream. It's detaching from the how, but not so much that you're not open to different opportunities and options to get there. I think sometimes we view, for me, this is kind of something I've learned is the vehicle can't be the vision necessarily all the time. So my example is like I had this vision of what kind of freedom I wanted to have as a mom, an entrepreneur with children. And so I thought, okay, homeschool. Homeschool is the vision, right? Because in homeschool, you can have the time freedom to travel, you can do this and this and this. Fast forward 5 years later, and homeschool was no longer the vehicle. Like the vision was actually bigger than homeschool. The vision was still to have that freedom. The vision was the way we connected to each other and got along and the way our household functioned. And so I had to detach from how I could create that vision of my life and the well balanced, harmonious home. And I think in entrepreneurship, we do the same thing. I coached somebody who had this plan of like, I want to own this whole print shop. I want to have this huge company. I want to have several employees. I want to do this and this and this. And at the end of the day, it was like the greater vision wasn't necessarily in it looking a certain way. It was the way she wanted to show up and build income for her family. And when she was able to detach from how it was supposed to look and what the ideal was, she was able to actually move forward and create income and do the things that were more in alignment with the bigger picture. And so I think that varies, right? Like sometimes it is, this is exactly what I want. I know what I want, and this is what I'm going to get. And I'm also willing to take the micro steps to get there because, yeah, maybe I don't start by buying all the print shop stuff. Maybe I start by using someone else's, which is then going to get me closer. But you don't necessarily, we're not saying give up on the big vision. We're saying maybe question a little bit and ask yourself, what's the vision? And am I attaching the vehicle? Am I too connected to the how and thinking I need to control everything? And then I'm stopping the flow of success and stopping the opportunities that are literally right there that will get me to that huge, big, cool dream. I love what you said. Our psychoanalyst hats can be on and say, are you making that dream so big because inherently deep down you don't believe you can have it? Or is it because you with firm faith believe that you will have it and you're not willing to compromise? I think that is really powerful questioning to ask yourself when you have a big thing and you don't want to pull back.
Yeah. I sort of, our society really encourages very dramatic, grand vision, sort of big risks in a sort of way. As I get older, I probably look relatively young because I'm a little bit disheveled. But as I go, I'm 40. So as I get, actually, I'm 40 in a few days. So if you'd like to send me flowers or something, you can. No.
Happy
As I
birthday.
get a little bit older, I start to realize that you're. It's really easy. We're constantly borrowing other people's dreams subconsciously
Mm-hmm.
because we're humans and we have all these mirror neurons in our brain, and whatever reason it is, we sort of very quick to be like, oh, I want that, or I want that, or I want that.
Mm-hmm.
And as you get a little bit older, you I'll give you like a really dumb example. When you're a little kid, if you think back to when you're a little kid, or you have kids, so you don't have to think that far back, and like a giant ice cream sundae comes out for someone other family. If I was a kid, I'd be like, I want that. And now when I'm older, I'm like, that would give me a really bad stomach ache. I'm actually
Yep.
pretty full. Maybe like one scoop of ice cream, but there's no way that we could, that kind of thing.
Yep.
Like you sort of know that. Um, but our entrepreneur brains are younger than we are because we start our lives as consumers.
Mm-hmm.
We don't really start. Most people don't start their lives as creators or entrepreneurs. So we get really good at consuming. And by the time you're however old, you have a pretty good sense of like, that's overpriced, that's good for me. I had that once, but it broke. I like that brand. I don't like that brand. But you don't have that same kind of instincts and skills as a builder of brands or a builder of company or a builder of income and revenue and all these things. It's like, that's a cool kind of customer to have, but I think it's going to be hard to collect money from them. That's a
Mm.
cool business to have, but those really small transactions, that's tricky to pull off. That's a cool business, but I've never done checks over 10K and people are charging like 50K a month for that. That's a little bit, you develop all these, I don't know,
Yeah.
musculature that you can lean on. So I think we for especially people that are earlier in their journey, even if you're older than me in your early journey, it's the same kind of thing. You have to work really hard to build up the production musculature.
Mm.
And micro entrepreneurship and small acts of entrepreneurship are oftentimes good ways to sort of build that up.
Yeah.
Like a really interesting, like very micro business is a like a fractional business. So an example of that would be, I'll give you like, I imagine you live in like some sort of rural place, even though you may not. So apologies, but I like to imagine Utah and just imagine like beautiful, St. George, sort of
Yep.
barren, beautiful, simple land. But let's imagine that you, your cousin has a really good friend who's a butcher, and summer's coming, and you're like, I'm going to buy an entire side of meat and I'm going to fractionalize it for my friends. That's a business. You go to
Mm.
the guy and he's like, hey, it's going to be $2,000 for the whole thing. And you go, okay, $2,000. Hey, how do you normally cut it up? And they're like, well, you got a lot of options. And you're like, cool. So you make a little order form and you go around to all your friends and your neighbors and say, hey, I'm going to buy a whole thing of meat and I'm going to have it cut up and I'm going to deliver it to you and we can eat it together if you want to do a barbecue. But like, we don't have to. You can eat it with your family, whatever. How much meat would you want if I did that? People get into that because you're going to buy meat anyway
Yeah.
and they love the idea that they know where it came from. But the reason why I'm saying that is that you can make a really nice margin on it, and no one's gonna be upset that you took a margin on it because you went to all the pain of like going to the butcher and organizing the thing and choosing the cow and all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
But you might walk away with $2,000,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
you've done an act of entrepreneurship that is very real and has that's enough money for you to either do it again if that's what you feel like, this time maybe do some flyers to do it, maybe, or you could just do something totally different. You can say, well, I have $2,000 in my entrepreneurial test pool, I'm going to do something else
Yeah.
with this.
Mm.
And we're talking, there are people that build multi-million dollar businesses flash freezing salmon in Alaska, putting it in freeze dried with freeze dried, fried, what's it called, dry ice, and shipping it to people all over the world. So you could build a giant business doing just this, or you can use it as sort of like a baby step to entrepreneurship. But that's sort of like fractional
Mm.
thing is like an example of a business that you can see people test. That's like one time. It's not a big investment. It's not a big commitment. It's very few people involved, and it sort of gets the wheels going. And
Yeah.
a similar thing that you find is that people who live in, let's tell a fanciful story. Let's say your friend is from rural Utah, but they live in Los Angeles or they live in San Diego or they live in Orange County or something. And they might have all these friends from college, let's say. Let's just tell the story. It's your friend's daughter who went to college. Your friend could literally start a business that goes, I'm going home to Utah for a week over ski week. Do you want to come with me, go skiing, stay on my farm, do farm stuff? You might find a lot of city kids, including me, because I'm from a city, being like, that sounds amazing. And it's like, I'm going to charge everyone $500 per person, and you buy your own lift ticket, and that's going to cover blah, blah, blah. And my cousin's going to drive out and pick us up and drive us back or something. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
you just started a business. You started a weird domestic travel business, but those acts of entrepreneurship, those can generate money. They can get the wheels turning. You can generate value for people. So I just find that there's like a lot of things that our society tells you. It's a heavy investment. It's the borrowing from the bank. It's the grand gestures of entrepreneurship that really make the difference. And
Mm-hmm.
honestly, if you look at the history of most very successful people prior to like 1985, most of them were like, I'm a billionaire. How'd you become a billionaire? I'm a home builder. Okay, what did you do? Well, I built one home in Nebraska and I made a profit on it. Then I built another one next to it. And then after I collected enough money, I bought enough land to build a whole neighborhood. And I built a neighborhood. And then I went and I marketed each of those individually. And right? It's like
Mm-hmm.
that kind of business is how business is built. It's not big vision, going to buy out the company. It's going to be a leverage buyout. I'm going to borrow a lot of money. I'm going to go buy it. And then I'm going to own this thing. And then I'm going to squeeze profits out of it. Well, I'm 40 years old. That stuff really only became super prominent in like 80s, 90s corporate raider stuff. Because you live in Utah, you have to inherently know every single bit of history about Mitt Romney that ever existed. But when Mitt Romney was running for president, which I know a lot of people listening probably didn't even remember that Mitt Romney was a top contender for president many years ago, people were so upset and attacking him for being a private equity guy who was buying companies and squeezing profits out of them, whatever. That probably lost him the election. People were so overwhelmed and being like, that's what private equity does? That's vulture capitalism. Now that stuff is so commonly talked about. I'm not saying it's good or
Mm-hmm.
bad or whatever. It's so commonly talked about that people think that that's what capitalism is.
Yeah.
People think that, yeah, I'm going to buy that farm stand. I'm going to fire all these competent people and I'm going to have a robot that's going to serve. It's like, that's not the kind of capitalism you have to do.
Yeah.
Capitalism can be the exact opposite.
Yep.
I could go on and on.
No, you're a
I'm
wealth
feeling,
of
I'm in a
like,
slightly reminiscing mood today.
yeah. Well, I love it. And we didn't even talk a whole lot about your company and email marketing, cold marketing, but I think everybody can go and check out what it is that you're doing. I would love to talk forever about that, about everything, but I think,
Well, you can have me on again. We can talk
yeah,
about it.
let's do it again.
If people have questions,
Yep.
you can about that. I'm happy to answer. They can just email me. But yeah, there's lots to talk about. I think it's a fascinating subject.
Yeah.
I'm glad you gave me the chance to riff on it a bit.
Me too, because you had a lot that needed to be said, unsolicited advice. I don't care. Like we're glad that we solicited you for this advice today, even if it wasn't the intention.
Well, it's unsolicited advice for everyone. Isn't a podcast just
Yep.
unsolicited advice?
Sure.
Because I don't know any of your listeners. Well, maybe I know them, but
well, they did have to hit play, right? They knew what they were in for somewhat.
yeah, they're all like,
hopefully.
what's this guy? Okay, I'll push play. Let's see what happens. And they're driving and then hopefully
their whole lives
they
are
were
changed.
Like, hopefully they were like, gosh darn it, I can't find the stop button. I need to.
They dropped their phone and they had to listen the whole time. Oh my gosh. Well, thank you again for everything you shared. Where can everybody find you online? Best place to connect with your company and you personally?
Yeah, LinkedIn is cool. I tend to check my messages and things there. Benny is my name, Benny, and my company is called Senders, SCNDERS.co. And that's also my email, benny@senders.co.
Awesome. Thank you. This was a fun riff conversation. You had a lot to share with us, and I loved every bit of it. Thank you again, Benny. It was really fun.
Thank you.